Hi, I'm Mr. Simons. In this video, we're going to have a look at categories of development. So the kind of terms and classifications we use to categorize economies around the world in terms of their level of economic development. Economic growth is all about the kind of material living standards of people in an economy, their income, their access to goods and services. Economic development is a broader measure that looks at the overall state of a person's life in an economy. So it's thinking about things like what's the state of healthcare, what's the quality of the education system like, how is infrastructure, what are the types of jobs that are available to people, those kinds of things. So economic growth, material living standards, economic development is a much broader measure of human welfare in an economy. So the first type of economy we might think about are advanced or developed economies. These are kind of like the industrialized, real sort of powerhouses of our global economy. Those economies that have undergone that transformation a long time ago, from agriculture to manufacturing to services to high-tech industries. So we're thinking about places like America, Germany, the UK, France, those kind of places. So typically they have high national incomes in terms of gross national incomes per capita, so GNI per capita. That if we think about advanced economies, that their birth rates are relatively low and slow, population growth is relatively low and slow, and that they can be reliant on migration to get some of those extra skills and population growth that their economies require. If we look at kind of the other side of things, we look at the developing economies. These economies are heavily reliant on agriculture. Typically, they haven't industrialized and moved towards more efficient and productive ways of producing goods and services. Typically, there are also question marks about the kind of strength of governments and political institutions in those economies, that sometimes there can be degrees of corruption and other elements in those economies, which make development a bit harder because the money doesn't go towards people who might need it the most. So there are question marks over those political institutions. Also, in developing economies, we tend to have very high birth rates, very large population growth, and some sense of social and political instability. Now, before you yell at me in the comments, there are different situations in different countries. I know this. We're just providing a kind of general overview about how we might classify countries around the global economy. So if we think about who we would say are developing economies, you might think about places like Zimbabwe, you might think about places like certain countries in Africa as well, that are not at that level of development or really on the path to it either. That something also to mention about developing economies is that they usually have high rates of poverty, and also they might be heavily reliant on foreign aid because they don't have strong domestic industries to provide people with incomes and funds for important things like infrastructure. So our final classification is what's known as emerging economies. So here we might talk about like China, India, Brazil, that these are the kind of rapidly industrializing economies around the world. So that in terms of their growth rates, that they are growing rapidly, that they might be high or low in a relative sense, but their growth rates year over year are increasing rapidly. And they're tending to see a lot of foreign investment, a lot of foreign interest in terms of getting involved in their economic growth. So they're accelerating rapidly, they're moving past agriculture to manufacturing and production. We can see this very much in economies like China that have left sort of that agricultural focus well behind and are now the world's manufacturing hub. Something also to think about with emerging economies is that the income levels of people in the economy might vary quite a bit. You might have people that are getting wealthy very quickly and people at the bottom that are not seeing that same level of improvement. But what emerging economies have in common is that income is growing rapidly. So the growth between different parts of society might be different, but they are overall seeing relatively rapid rates of growth in their incomes compared to developing and developed economies. So as I mentioned before, that these are not perfect classifications, that there are all sorts of crossovers and exceptions that expose some of the flaws in trying to categorize economies into one of three categories. But it's useful in terms of just thinking about the different states of economic development of countries around the world. Okay, so any questions in the comments? Hopefully this was useful, and as always, thank you very much for watching.